Hi, everyone. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Glad you're here. I'm so excited about this interview. I'm here with James Fodor, and this is just, as I've started to get to know this person via his podcast and book, I've just become even more excited about this interview. So just want to give you a little bit of introduction. He's working on his PhD in neuroscience, has a degree in physics, has made this amazing podcast called The Science of Everything. And just the breadth of subjects that he covers on this podcast. It's just amazing how knowledgeable he is in so many areas of science. And then he also just has a great interest in philosophy, religion, and has written this great book called Unreasonable Faith: How William Lane Craig Overstates the Case for Christianity. And so I just thought he did a great job with this book. I really enjoyed it. And so I'm excited to welcome James Fodor. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, you covered some of the main points in your rather glowing introduction. So I might add a couple of things. So I grew up, with respect to my religious background, I grew up as a Mormon. So I was in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the official name. So I was part of that for 20 years. And then I left that when I was about 20 and sort of became a non-believer, or as I would now say, an atheist. And yeah, I've been studying different subjects at university for quite a while now, and have just recently started a PhD in neuroscience. So I'm interested in understanding how people think and reason and make decisions and so forth. And I'm also interested in, because of my background, partly I think in other interests, I'm continued in dialogues about religion, and particularly apologetics and philosophy of religion related topics. And so my book sort of came out of some discussions I had with people about that. And more recently, I've started doing some videos on YouTube, responding to apologists online mostly, and discussing some other related questions. So that's a bit about me.
Cool. And, I love, if you want to check out any, James has a YouTube channel, and I put the link to the podcast in the description. Also put a link to his book there, and then to his website, which is called The Godless Theist. So can you tell us about that name? Like, why are you the Godless Theist?
Excuse me. I chose the name because it was I was just kind of trying to think of a name that would be interesting and sort of draw attention to how I think that, although I'm an atheist, right? So in that sense, I'm godless. I still think that there's a lot of value in thinking about and talking about and studying theism and religious traditions and philosophy and practices historically and in the present. I think a lot of atheists or other people who aren't religious just kind of dismiss religion and philosophy of religion and related issues, and just have basically no interest in it, which I think is a mistake. So I just kind of chose the name to be a bit provocative and kind of gesture at that facet.
Cool. And one thing I forgot to mention about you also is that you have written for a lot of, you wrote for Rationalist magazine and just some other secular publications. So you've written quite a lot about
Australian
religion
magazine
and philosophy.
Yeah, that's right. And I also, as you mentioned, writings on my blog. So it's something that I've been trying to work at for a while in terms of developing my thoughts about things, and also responding to other claims that people make, basically. My goal, maybe would be helpful to mention, is not really to deconvert people or convince people to be atheists. I'm not particularly interested in that, but I am interested in trying to persuade and also help people to think more rigorously and critically and systematically about their beliefs, regardless of what they are, really. And I suppose I do have a particular interest in responding to what I consider to be quite bad arguments, or mostly bad or overstated arguments from a particular sort of brand of evangelical apologetics, because that's fairly influential in, say, the English-speaking world.
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of answers what I wanted to ask you, which is, your motivation for writing this book, because, I mean, it was obvious to me as I read this that it took an incredible amount of effort and research to go through these arguments. And so it just kind of surprised me how much effort you put into really just evaluating one Christian apologist's arguments for God. So do you have anything more to say about your motivation? Like what caused you to put so much effort into this particular man's arguments?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there's sort of a few things to say about that. One is that I originally, this project started out of some of the writings that I had that I've been working on, and some of these earlier versions are still on my blog, about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And the reason for that is because a number of friends who I was in conversation with were advancing that argument and appealing to various scholars, and also making certain claims about the quality of the evidence and lack of comparative cases in other traditions and such. And I was sort of skeptical about, I mean, I still am skeptical about those claims, but I wanted to do a bit more due diligence. And so one of the early projects that I started is researching comparative miracle claims across different religious traditions. Mm-hmm. And there's a fair bit of that wound up in my book. But that was the sort of some initial work that I was doing that came out of those conversations. At the same time, different people have different places that they go to or figures that they interact with. And one that came up pretty regularly was William Lane Craig. Obviously, he's a prolific debater, and I think he's a lot better at organizing his thoughts and being systematic and so forth than a lot of other apologists are. So I found I liked that aspect of his style. And so, yeah, so it's sort of been influential in some of the discussions that I've been having. Then probably about 5 years ago now, or even 6 years ago, a friend of mine who I knew from the Rationalist Society here in Australia, where I'm from, mentioned that there was, because I'd done a bit of writing for them, and she just mentioned to me that there was a new publisher that had set up in the UK that was publishing, or was interested in having taking submissions from people who were in broadly sort of humanistic or rationalist or skeptical atheistic traditions, and they published work in sort of science philosophy there. That's Occam Press, they're called, or Occam Publishing or something like that. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I could get some of the writings that I've done about the resurrection published, because I think that there's some new stuff in there that's not really discussed. And I sent that to them as a suggestion, and they said, it's interesting, but it's a little bit niche for us. And so I thought, well, maybe I could sort of combine this with a discussion of other arguments as well to make it more encompassing. And so I thought about like how to structure that, what would be different about it, because obviously there's already a lot of books out there. And I don't really exactly remember how I came to the idea, but I at some point decided, well, look, why not write a full response to William Lane Craig, because he's one of the more influential writers on the resurrection argument. He's published on that. And then I could basically add to that responses to his other arguments, particularly the Kalam cosmological argument. This is sort of his other really main one that he's published on. And one of the reasons, apart from the fact that he's so influential, is because at least at the time that I published, and I believe this is still true, there are no other book-length responses to Craig's entire apologetic. Like, there are responses to parts of it and papers that certain people have published, but no sort of comprehensive coverage that looks systematically across his apologetic work. And so I thought, well, I could potentially contribute to filling that void, and also make that a way of publishing some of my other stuff. And so I spent I don't know, like 18 months or whatever, working on compiling all that stuff together and sent it off. And yeah, eventually, after a lot of editing and other things, that was published. So yeah, that's how that came to happen.
Wow, Cool. Thanks for sharing. Hello to everyone in the chat. Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you for being here. I'm glad Maverick Christian is here because I know he's got great questions. And I will answer. Somebody asked, do I have kids? Yes, I have 2 kids. I have 2 boys, teenage boys. And guys, if you have questions for James, please do put them in the chat. And when I can, I will look at them. I'm trying to pay attention to what he's saying, so I may not be as responsive on the chat as I like to be when I'm doing it myself. So I guess since we've been talking about your book, we can talk about some of the arguments that you made. I really thought a lot of your arguments were very successful, but I actually don't care about apologetics very much, and this might be
That's
the
why I was surprised why you like my book so much, because I didn't know you were that interested in this stuff, to be honest.
No, I'm not. Actually, this is probably the first like real book that I've read on apologetics, because I guess I just tell people what I believe, and if they don't believe it, oh well. I don't, feel like I have to make a deep philosophical argument about it. So I don't really pay attention to even William Lane Craig's arguments. I've heard him speak a few times, and I thought he was very good and very persuasive. But as I started kind of looking at some of the arguments you were making, I was like, you know what, that's a good argument. And so I guess where I thought it was, one of the most difficult section is actually the first argument that you talk about, the Kalam. So, which I guess is a very big one for William Lane Craig. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Kalam cosmological argument just is a form of the cosmological argument, which basically is a set of arguments that try to establish the existence of God on the basis of some aspect of the beginning of the universe or the cosmos. So that's the general idea is, well, how did it come to be? Well, God created it, so God must exist is a very general description. There are different versions of it. Craig has developed what he calls the Kalam. So that that's an idea that's been developed from the work of medieval Islamic theologians, which he's kind of modernized and put in his particular form. The basic idea of the argument is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe had a cause, so the universe... no, I got that wrong, didn't I? Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And then Craig goes on to give an argument as to why the cause must be a personal cause and have these other properties, and then he identifies that cause with God. So essentially, he uses the fact that the universe began to exist and must have therefore had a cause as a way to get to the existence of God.
And so what's the main problem with that?
Well, so in my discussion, I identify a number of, I guess, assumptions or issues that Craig needs to resolve in order for the argument to work. I think one of them, which is the first issue that I discuss and perhaps the most technical, relates to philosophy of time. Craig relies on a particular understanding of time for his argument to go forward. I would say, though, that the biggest, there are other issues that I discuss, but if you ask for the biggest problem, honestly, I think the biggest problem is establishing the nature of the cause. So even if we grant most of his argument, which is that the universe began to exist and that it had a cause, there's still the question as to the nature of the cause. And I find the arguments that Craig and others give for why the cause has to be a personal being who has, omni properties or whatever exactly what they want to establish as extremely unpersuasive. And I think there are just a lot of other options, some of which I discuss in my book, as to what the cause could be. And honestly, I think that the best, really at this point, the best answer is we don't know what the cause was, but I don't think we have good reason for thinking that it must have been personal.
Well, that's one thing I liked is that you actually made suggestions for what the other, you suggested Brahman. I'm here like on page 134 and you're like, or the Tao. So you made suggestions for other possible causes. And yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. I also thought your explanation of the problem of tensed time, it was really quite difficult for me to follow at some points because it was technical, but I thought it was like really strong when you said that like if all that exists is what is present, then what exactly counts as present? Is it the present second, the present minute, the present year, or something else? And you really talked about how, like, this is going to take us on infinite regress if we're trying to, like, define what the present is. And, then you've got to, like, it seems to be able to go on this infinite regress, which is something that William Lane Craig uses it as an argument for why, in other areas, he says we can't have this infinite regress. So I thought that was interesting.
Yes, I think that's a big weakness of Craig's version of the argument, at least, which he thinks depends on that view called presentism, which is, as you said, only the present exists. Then that raises the question, what is present? And as I discuss, I don't think Craig has any plausible options for that. Basically, all of the possibilities that he could appeal to are ruled out by other arguments that he gives elsewhere. And so he's left with this view that what is present, like, is relative to your, like, what you're referring to, whether it's the present second or the present hour or the present eon, presumably, which is really just bizarre and seems to imply that we, like, bring things into being by thinking about them or creating them, which I don't think makes any sense. And Craig is just... The thing that annoys me really is that Craig really only talks about this in very dense academic volumes, which I had to read most of to, write this. But what he'll do is occasionally this comes up in debates, not often because people don't usually bring him up on this. But when it occasionally does, he'll just say, oh, I've written about this. But, like, no one's going to read, first of all, buy these very expensive books and then, read through them. They're very long and very dense, and then, like, find the relevant parts and then sort of be able to understand all of that. I had difficulty understanding of it, and this is something I spent a lot of time doing, right?
Right.
So I think that I just think that he's being deliberately obfuscatory about parts of the argument that he knows are kind of weaker, like defining what the present is. And yeah, I mean, I'm very critical of him for that. Not just here, but elsewhere as well.
Okay. I want to put up this comment and see how you respond to it. Otangelo says, we have good reasons that the cause of to think that the cause of the universe must be personal. One is that matter does not generate consciousness. What do you think?
Yeah, hey, Otangelo, we've interacted before. I mean, I think that it should be, so I'm what's sometimes called a naturalist or a materialist or a physicalist. So I draw a strong distinction between those. So I don't think there's anything that exists that's not physical or material in some sense. So obviously I don't agree that matter can't generate consciousness, right? I think that consciousness is a sort of an emergent phenomenon or a set of properties of particular configurations of matter. So, yeah, I mean, I just don't accept that premise there. Now, what Craig argues is that a conscious agent or a free agent has a particular, I guess, causal powers is the way he would put it, that allows them to act in the absence of any sort of antecedent state. Like what he says, if it's some sort of physical cause, then there has to be a cause of that, and that leads you to infinite regress. But he thinks that what he calls agent causation, which is like libertarian free will, just deciding to do something without any antecedent causes, he thinks that avoids that problem. But personally, I don't actually see that he has much of an argument there. He basically just says libertarian agents like God just have this special causal power that allows them to do this. But from my point of view, I can just say, well, maybe whatever caused the universe has a special causal power that allows it to cause the universe without any antecedent state. Like if we're just invoking special causal properties or powers that are different from, the normal ones, then I can do that as well and just not say that it's not personal. And I mean, obviously Craig's going to say, well, it has to be personal because it's agent causation, and we could talk about that. But I don't think he has any advantage there. I think that he just stipulates that it has the properties that he needs. And obviously that discuss this more in the book.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I'm out of my element in this discussion. I want to ask you good questions about this, but this is not like my area of expertise. But I just wanted to mention one area like that I thought was a little bit of a weakness in your argument about the Kalam, even though I thought overall, like, I was really impressed, and I thought the tenseless and tensed time thing was really good, and how you brought like general relativity into it, and you were like, hey, look, time is, if we're gonna say, like, you kind of explained that, like, if time is a dimension and fabric, like it's woven in, and you made a little graph and just Anyway, I might want you to explain that. Go ahead and explain that.
Yeah,
right
no, that's
now.
fine. No, you're
and then I
want to
add. Then I want to tell you just one of the areas that I thought was a little bit weak on your Kalam argument.
Sure. I mean, the basic idea is what you were just saying, that according to general relativity, or the way that that's understood, time and space are essentially connected. They form what you could call four-dimensional space-time, which you think of as like a fabric that sort of can be folded up or bunched over, to put it loosely. And the issue there is that it doesn't really seem there's any room for the kind of presentism that Craig wants, because even if you want to say that there's some sort of preferred way to slice up the time, which some people have said, I just don't think that works, because like massive objects in general relativity cause space-time to bend. And that means they're bending time as well as space. And it's hard to understand how according to Craig, like time is just a succession of presence of things coming into and going out of existence. Like, how can that be bent by mass? I don't think it makes sense. I mean, you could just say that's how it works, but that starts to get really ad hoc to me. And if you just look at, I mean, I give some other aspects of this as well, where the description of time according to general relativity and the description of time according to Craig and presentism, they're just so different that I don't think you can reconcile them. And so if you take general relativity as describing at least approximately the way space and time really are, which I think we should, because there's a lot of evidence for it, then I just don't think presentism works. And Craig says that the Kalam relies on presentism. So I think that's why I discuss this, because I think it's very important. I should add, there are other people who believe that the Kalam doesn't require presentism and argue slightly differently. And so this particular issue wouldn't be relevant. But Craig does think that it is. So therefore, I think that objection is important.
Yeah.
So what was your objection?
So I thought your discussion, here where you're like talking about the idea of like things don't pop into existence, and I mean like you're responding to Craig's argument about how like, yeah, of course things don't just pop into existence out of nothing, and you're kind of like picking on his wording, but you don't really offer another alternative. Like you say about like things popping into existence out of nothing, you said, of course, this is an absurd picture, that the absurdity results from the mischaracterization of the situation, not the absence of a cause. A causeless beginning does not imply coming from nothing, since the latter, as I have argued, implies a something that the universe came from, and a prior state to which the coming refers, neither of which pertain to this case. But like, I didn't feel like you asserted like the way in which, like, I didn't get like an alternative, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I may not have been as clear at that particular passage as I could have been. So, how you describe this depends a little bit on philosophy of time. But if we assume presentism, like Craig's preferred philosophy for the moment, then the way I would describe the beginning of the universe, if it didn't have a cause, is just that the universe began without a cause. Like, that's how I would say it. The problem with saying it came from nothing is I think the preposition from, because when you say from, there's it's hard to describe this without saying from, right? But there's sort of two things. There's where you come from and then where you go to. Like, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to say that the universe came from anything, because there wasn't anything. That's what the reason I'm objecting to is Fraser, because he uses that term a lot in debates, and I think it's a rhetorical flourish that's deliberately misleading, because there's no from, right? If the universe began, there's nothing before it. So I don't think like from just doesn't apply to anything. It's just the universe began and there wasn't a cause. That is the claim. Or if the universe didn't have a cause, obviously. I mean, I'm happy to say it did, but if we're just saying that it didn't for the sake of argument, you wouldn't say the universe came from nothing. You would just say the universe began without a cause. That would, I think, be the appropriate description. Now, you may still say, well, that can't happen. But what I'm saying here is at least we should describe that in a sort of a fair, neutral way and not imply that somehow there was a previous state that kind of existed. Which I think that's why he uses that language of coming from nothing, because it's like, it doesn't make sense. Like, nothing is not a thing that you can come out of. Like, it doesn't. You just say it began without a cause. That is, I think, a better way to say it.
I don't know. And this is for me, just I can't fathom something, something coming into existence without a cause. So I mean.
Yeah, well, that's a somewhat different argument, though.
Yeah.
So if we're to say, yeah, well, we just don't think that things can begin without causes, then we'd have to address the issues of like, well, what counts as a cause, which actually I don't talk about in my book, but also, well, like why we would think that. Craig gives a number of arguments as to why we should think that everything that begins to exist should require a cause. I don't think they're very persuasive. But I mean, I think a meta point here is simply that I don't really trust our intuitions about this sort of thing. So it seems intuitive to us that things that begin have causes, but I don't know why we would expect our intuitions to apply to the very beginning of space and time and the whole universe. Like we don't, our intuitions are based on things that we observe on the Earth and within time, within space. I think that I just don't believe in extrapolating our intuitions to that level and having confidence in that. Craig seems okay with doing that. I don't really accept that as very persuasive, but I mean, at the end of the day, some people just think, well, no, that doesn't make sense, so it has to have a cause, but I don't find that persuasive.
Okay, I understand that, not as trusting in our intuitions. Maverick Christian says, how exactly does relativity imply presentism? The equations seem consistent with both presentism and eternalism.
So what I was saying is that general relativity implies that presentism is false, not that it does imply presentism. Maybe that was just a mistype, or I don't know if I was unclear. But if you say the equations seem consistent, I mean, it's not the equations that are the problem, because for any scientific theory, you can interpret it in a realist way or in a instrumentalist or non-realist way. And the difference is whether you think that the scientific theory is just a sort of a predictive tool that allows us to make accurate predictions that then can be we can test experimentally and so forth. Maybe it's useful for technology and such, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about how the world sort of really is, underlying things. An example of why you might think this would be something like Newtonian physics, which has this idea of a uniform flat space and time, which is and that model is very accurate for a lot of applications, but we now know, because of relativity at the large scale and quantum mechanics at the small scale, that Newtonian mechanics doesn't actually apply everywhere. So the picture developed, or that you would get out of Newtonian mechanics, is sort of not true, or at least it's highly incomplete, despite the fact that it's predictively useful, at least in some applications. So perhaps you might be concerned that that would be true for any scientific theory, regardless of how useful it is. Maybe it doesn't really tell us how the world like really is. And if you took that attitude to general relativity, then you might be perfectly fine in accepting presentism with general relativity, because you say, look, it's predictively useful, but it doesn't actually tell us about the way the world really is. Now, the problem with that for William Lane Craig is that he then goes on to appeal to scientific arguments that he argues show that the universe must have begun to exist, like the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and other things that I discuss in my book. So in doing so, he's interpreting those scientific theories realistically, as in that they really describe the way the world really is. So what he can't do is eat his cake and have it too. He can't, on the one hand, use an instrumentalist reading of general relativity to get out of the fact that I think that the ontology implied by general relativity, if you interpret it realistically, is just flat out contradicts presentism. And at the same time, then interpret findings in cosmology, which include general relativity, or rely on that realistically when he wants to argue for the beginning of the universe. So that's the issue here. And I think Craig generally is a scientific realist. So I think he's going to want to say, yes, our best scientific theories do actually tell us something about how the world works, at least approximately. And in that case, and I also agree with that. And in that case, I would say that general relativity does tell us something about how the world works, and it isn't how presentism describes it.
Did you catch all that, viewers? Because I'm just smiling and nodding at some of this.
No, that's fine. I'm very happy to talk about the things that you're interested in as well, not just the things that...
Oh, yeah, totally. We're going to get there.
I'm interested in.
So Maverick Christian says, yes, it was a mistype. So, but there's a lot of good questions here, but I want to put up, let's see, Sentinel Apologetics says, James, via the ACDM model, why such a vast, old, lonely, dark, exotic, ordinary matter, fine-tuned, constant laws, and decaying universe? When all put together, the cause is personal. Okay, I guess that's not a question, but
yeah, I feel like that's just an argument. I'll just make a... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's the lambda CDM model, which is sort of the standard cosmological model. I mean, I feel like I don't know why the universe is as large as it is or dark. I mean, that is a product of really how old it is. Oh, sorry, I was looking at all the terms there. I don't think the theist has an explanation for those things either. Now, fine-tuning is a different kettle of fish. Maybe we can talk about that later if you're interested. I've done debates on this. I don't accept the universe is fine-tuned, but obviously I expect Sentinel Pod X isn't going to agree with that, and I'm not going to say something's going to convince him in like a minute. So I'm just going to leave that. But as for the other points, I don't think that any of us can explain why the universe is as large or old or dark or anything as it is. Like, I don't see what explanation theists have for this. Theists can say, well, God made it that way, but that's not an explanation because God could make it anyway, presumably. Like, well, so I don't see that anyone's better off there. I'm also not sure how any of those properties imply a personal cause, because I mean, you can use this as an argument for atheism. I feel if God created the universe for us or for embodied intelligent minds or something like that, then why is so much of the universe inhospitable to such minds? The analogy I've given is like if you add on a new room to your house and you say, I'm building this room in order to be a library, I'm going to put my books in here, that's why I've made it. And then you go in there with your friend and there's like 2 books in the corner and the whole room is empty, or it's like filled with plants or something. You're like, it doesn't look like that's the reason you made the room. Like, that's a bit strange. So now, of course, God may have his other reasons for making the universe this way, right? But all I'm saying is, if you can just invoke arbitrary reasons that we don't have access to, then I don't think you can explain it. It's just, we don't know why God would have made it that way. We don't know why it is that way according to nature. I don't think anyone has an explanation of those properties. I say here, I'm not talking about fine-tuning. I'm talking about the other properties mentioned. Fine-tuning is a different issue. But yeah, I don't find those sorts of appeals very convincing. I don't expect that will convince people like Sentinel Apologetics, because we could probably have to have a 2-hour discussion about that. But
right, and that's actually, some initial thoughts. With the arguments in your book, we could have like a much longer discussion about all of these. And I'm kind of more interested in asking some personal questions too.
Sure.
So I don't want to do 2 hours of all this stuff, but I do want to say that your fine-tuning arguments, I thought that you did like a good job, with the arguments against the William Lane Craig's fine-tuning argument. And I wanted to ask you, what was your favorite argument to challenge? You mentioned you had a really big interest in the resurrection. So was that the argument that was most fun for you to challenge in your book?
Yeah, I think that's the argument that I'm most interested in. I think for 2 reasons. One is that I think that's where I have most that's novel to say. And the second reason is because I think that's actually a reason or an argument that actually persuades people. I think that most people who are religious, even like, I guess, more intellectual types, that is people who read books about this stuff or listen to talks, don't really believe because of cosmological or fine-tuning arguments. There may be a few, right? But I think that's pretty rare, actually. But the resurrection argument is definitely an argument that I've come across in many times talking to Christians, and that I think is actually a contributor to why they believe. Also, I just think general theism is kind of interesting from a general, I guess, philosophical point of view, but even if you get to a greater God, it doesn't tell you very much about the nature of that God or what they want, or so you don't. I don't think there's a lot of sort of meat on the bone, to use that analogy, with a general theism. I'm much more interested in specific theistic claims or like theologies. So and that's obviously relevant for Christological argument or resurrection argument. So I find that the most interesting.
Well, I think it's interesting that you feel like a lot of people are convinced by that argument. And I mean, for me, I don't find the argument about the resurrection compelling at all. Like, I don't think that, like, I mean, great if people want to argue it, but I mean, like,
yeah, I've heard some Christians say that. I don't want to imply that all do, but I have encountered.
Yeah, I mean, like, a lot of weird stuff happens in the world. Guy gets out of the grave, or like his body disappears. I don't know. I mean, there could be lots of explanations for that. And I thought in your book, you presented a very good, hypothesis for what could have happened to Jesus's body. Now, I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression here, because I am a Christian. I believe Jesus died and rose again. I totally believe it, but I just believed the story. I read it. I read the Bible. I believed it. And so I still believe it. And I've been experiencing Jesus for, many years now. So I totally believe all this stuff. It's just, I don't think anybody could have ever convinced me that it was true, like by making an argument about, well, so-and-so amount of people saw him alive and all this stuff. So, but I thought that was interesting that in your book, you were like, I think this is Craig's strongest argument for the existence of God. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact words I used. If I did say that, I would probably rephrase it slightly, because I don't actually think that the resurrection. I think the resurrection argument is the strongest argument for the truth of Christianity. I don't actually think that it's an argument for the existence of God, although it is sometimes presented as such. And I discuss the reason for this in my book, because I think that it only even works as an explanation if you already have some sort of assumptions. Well, actually, I think quite a lot of assumptions about God and what he'd be likely to do and his intentions. So if you come to the question with some presuppositions or assumptions, or at least beliefs, let's say, about that, then I think that it becomes more plausible depending on those assumptions. But I think that that's when it has its power. As an argument for the existence of God, I don't really think it works, because if you're, well, yeah, for exactly the same reason, if you lack those assumptions, I don't think the explanation really makes any sense. I think that even putting the explanation I give to aside, you can always just come up with something else, like, well, aliens did it for a joke. And like, unless you have particular belief about the probabilities of God versus aliens, I don't see what is worse about that explanation. And I think that most arguments that people give in response to that do appeal to particular beliefs or assumptions about God or God's intentions or the likelihood of aliens and things like that. And that's precisely my point, right? So that's why I don't think it works as an argument for God per se. But if you come to the table with that, then I think, or not necessarily absolutely believe in God, but at least with, you think it's plausible or something, then I think that it is at least better than most other arguments that I've heard for Christianity.
Well, whoops, didn't mean to put that one up. Nope. I'm not saying it's not a bad comment. Thanks for your comment. I just wanted to put this one up because I do think this is a good explanation, like design. Like, what about
the best explanation of what's the...
Well, that it's a good argument for God, that it is like, when we look around, we see things that seem to be designed.
Yes.
So do you think that's a good argument for God?
I think some form of a teleological argument, which is what you've just articulated there, is probably the best argument for the existence of God. That's just my kind of subjective opinion about that. The fine-tuning argument is an example or a form of that. But there are other arguments. There are other forms of teleological argument that can be given. So I think they're better than many other forms of arguments. I don't find them very persuasive because they rely on a lot of assumptions about what could or could not come into being absent design, and also what the designer would be likely to do. And that's actually what I find the fundamental weakness there. This has sometimes been called the problem of divine psychology. In order to infer design, you have to have some knowledge about what a designer would or would not be likely to do. And I actually think that if you posit an omnipotent and omniscient designer, then you have very little restriction on what they would or would not be likely to do. So you need what I call a theology. Well, I mean, that's not my term, but I mean a theology in the sense of a set of beliefs about what that being would or would not be more or less likely to do to constrain the possibility space. Because I think you need that for it to be an explanation, because otherwise I could just say the super powerful aliens did it because they felt like it, because they like making universes in their simulated computers. Like, I can just say something like that, and you would probably say that's just ad hoc, you're just making it up. And I guess the point would be, well, but yeah, because there's no constraints on what I can appeal to if there's sort of the being is arbitrarily powerful and has no known intentions or purposes. So I think that that's the main weakness of design type arguments.
Well, what about, because I'm not making the argument that the designer would do this or wouldn't do this. I'm saying that when I look at a butterfly, I don't see how that could have assembled itself. And like with all the other things that I see in nature, I'm seeing things that, when I look at a car, I know that a car was designed. I may not know who designed it, but I know somebody did, because I know cars don't just assemble themselves. And so how much more these creatures that we see in nature, like, there seems to be design, and that implies a designer. So what about that? Well,
design obviously does imply a designer, but then that raises the question is how we recognize design. I'm not convinced by, this is basically the watchmaker argument, Paley's watchmaker argument, that we find a watch, we know that someone made it. I'm not really that persuaded by examples like that, because we have a lot of knowledge about where artifacts come from, and I believe that we're appealing to that knowledge when we make inferences about them. Even if you come across an unknown artifact, like if people have heard of the Antikythera mechanism, is basically a piece of technology that was discovered from ancient Greece. We don't really understand. Well, there's been worked on recently, so my knowledge may be out of date. But the point is, we didn't really understand much about how it was made or what it was for, at least when it was discovered. Maybe we still don't. But I mean, the point is, like, I think it was found in a shipwreck, and we know that, like, the ancient Greeks made mechanical devices of various sorts. Like, the point is, even if we don't know specifically about what it is and what it was for, we have general background knowledge about humans and our ability and interest in making devices and our technological capabilities and such that allow us to have that I think we're appealing to that general background knowledge whenever we appeal to those type of arguments. Now, when it comes to things in the natural world, I think that's quite different. Whether or not, so I'm not sure about how the butterfly argument would work if we didn't have, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection and similar scientific knowledge. I'm not sure, but I don't feel like I have the ability to extract that from my knowledge and then imagine what I would say absent that. So I would just say that regardless of that, we now have an explanation for how these things came to be. So I think that biological design arguments don't work. Mm-hmm. Now, cosmological type design arguments, of which the fine-tuning argument is an example, obviously they're not covered by that. So they're probably, I think they're stronger, but then we have to consider those and ask questions about what is the likelihood, like epistemically, that this outcome would have arisen by a not design versus the likelihood that it would have arisen by design, and assess those. And my argument is that the likelihood that these sorts of things would have arisen by non-design is essentially inscrutable. Like, I just don't think we know this, contrary to what a lot of people say. I disagree with that. I also think that under a design hypothesis, the likelihood that particular outcomes would have arisen is also inscrutable because we have no idea what God's intentions or purposes would be. So this is why I think that the argument is just not very good, because in order for the argument to go ahead, I think that you need to get to a position where you can say that this outcome is more likely under design than under not design, but you have to have some way of assessing those likelihoods or probabilities or whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we have that. I think that the methods that have been proposed or the arguments given are just basically subjective and based on other assumptions, like assuming that God would do this or that. Mm-hmm. And again, I can always concoct an explanation like, well, this is a simulation and aliens made it because of this or that purpose, right? Mm-hmm. And the question would be, why is that a worse explanation than God made it? And obviously, I don't believe that that's the best explanation, but the question would be, what objective criterion can we appeal to say that the God hypothesis is better than the alien hypothesis? And I'm not really convinced. I mean, that's just an example, right? You probably come up with better ones, but hopefully you see the point I'm driving at, which is that I don't believe we have the ability to assess that in an objective way. And that's why, at the end of the day, although I see some pull of the teleological arguments, but I don't find them very persuasive.
Okay. Well, I want to respond to Catholic traditionalist is kind of like wondering why I'm having an atheist on my channel and just letting you say all
Imagine
these
talking
ideas.
to an atheist.
It's because I think it's really important to listen to other people's perspectives and, not just demonize other perspectives, but really try to understand them. And I especially want and think James Fodor deserves to be heard because he's actually taken the time to evaluate the Christian perspective. And so, I think what he has to say is very valuable and it can help us. And if what we believe is true, then the truth has nothing to fear. So really there's, I just think James is a very intelligent person, a fascinating person with the breadth of knowledge that he has on a variety of subjects, and the fact that he's taken time to understand and listen to Christian arguments and make a response to them. So I think I was really excited about doing this interview. And but I am curious, James, as you're doing all these things, is there any motivation in you to, like, do you want to know if there is a God, like, or have you decided there is no God and so therefore I'm going to respond to all these arguments?
Well, I don't think there is a God. I've actually written an article, this was a few years ago, but I would stand broadly by this, that the probability that some God exists is about 10%. You might wonder how I came up with that. I'll just leave it to people to look at that and read it. I won't necessarily explain it here.
Okay.
So I don't actually think it's massively unlikely, although I think it's obviously more likely than not that there is no God. Now, that's any type of God, though, so Christianity is going to be lower than that necessarily. But so the point is, I I do believe that it's unlikely that, say, Christianity is true, but I don't accord. It's interesting. I find that if you ask people this question, most people go to the extremes to say it's either very likely or extraordinarily unlikely. There aren't too many people in the middle. There are a few, though. My friend Nathan Ormond is also a bit in the middle, though he's a bit more to the theist side than I am. But so I don't think there is a God. But the question of have I made up my mind, I find that a bit difficult, actually, and sometimes a bit frustrating when people talk about it in this way. And let me explain what I mean. So I don't mean to say that people need to be in a constant state of like massive uncertainty and constantly doubting everything that they do. That's not livable or practical. So I'm not suggesting that. However, I don't think it follows that we should be just sort of closed off from considering the questions or looking at new evidence or being open or like talking to people who have different views. I think that that's something that we should continue as a journey on our whole lives, ideally. And there'll be some times when we focus on that more and sometimes less. But the idea that, I mean, and the reason I'm sort of reacting to this is people have said this sort of thing before, like, well, are you still searching or have you just like decided? And I'm like, well, I mean, I've like decided in the sense that I have a view that I think is correct, but I haven't decided in the sense that like, well, I'm done now. I'm just not going to respond to any evidence or like listen to anyone. I don't even understand how that makes sense. Is that just like deciding that there's never anything that could possibly convince us or that there's no considerations that would be relevant that we haven't thought of? That just seems ridiculous to me. So I like to think that I'm always open to different arguments and evidences or different ways of looking at things. But at the same time, I am going to push and, raise my concerns and, ask for things to be clarified and so forth. And this is one of the reasons I like to engage with Christians to try to, and people from other traditions as well, so that I can understand better and raise my concerns and hopefully we can both profit from that. Does that answer your question?
Well, in a way, it doesn't help me understand why, like, you think you're 90% that God doesn't exist. Like, what about the world? What about reality makes you feel that way?
Oh, okay. Well, that's so one reason would be that I don't think the arguments for the existence of God are very persuasive. There's something there, obviously, because it's not 0.001%, it's 10. But the other reason would be that I do think that there are considerations that favor. Well, I prefer to talk about naturalism over atheism, but because atheism itself doesn't really narrow you down very much other than there's no God. But so I think that naturalism is a worldview that makes the most sense. It's a class of worldviews, but I'll just call it a worldview that makes the most sense of, I guess, our experience, what we take ourselves to know collectively. Obviously, not expecting you to agree with that. I'm just articulating what I think. So what sort of considerations? So the problem of evil, I think, is a fairly good argument. There's different versions of that. There's problems of divine hiddenness. There are other theological issues, which maybe I won't get into here, that I think are problematic. And basically, the sort of more meta point is that I think that God is explanatorily unnecessary. I think that we can understand everything, at least in principle. Well, I should clarify there. There are some things that I don't think anyone has an answer to. But for everything else, I think that, like, for example, like, why does the universe have the constants that it does? I just think that no one has a good explanation for this. I don't pretend to have one, but I don't think theists do either. But for other things, like, I mean, some other things I talk about, like consciousness or morality or most aspects of physics or the mind or abstract objects, so like what other things, some of which I talk about in my book, I think that the naturalist can give a cogent account of these to make sense of it. And that we don't need to appeal to God. So there's a sort of a parsimony argument that it's just sort of unnecessary. We don't need to postulate that. Again, obviously, I'm not expecting you or most of the people probably watching this to agree with that. So I'm not going to present that argument here because that would take a long time. I'm just saying that these sorts of considerations, basically, there's some arguments against God. So there's sort of three things. I don't think the arguments for God are very good. There are some arguments against the existence of God, like evil and hiddenness and others, theological problems. And I think that it's unnecessary to postulate God because I think that naturalism and related views are sufficient to account for the things that we need to. So that's how I get to the 90%.
Well, now I want to pick on this because you mentioned morality. It's sufficient, to discuss morals. And actually, your chapter on the moral argument, I thought was really good. And you made a successful argument against, the second premise of, and just for those who are not familiar with William Lane Craig's moral argument for God, it's if premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Premise two, objective moral values do exist. Conclusion, God exists. And I thought you were really successful in the way you did this in several ways, but most successfully on like attacking premise 2, objective moral values do exist, right? Like actually you didn't attack that so much. You more like rearranged it and you said, well, if objective moral values exist, then like we can start with that and we don't necessarily have to go with God. Like that, if it's true, if it's a true statement, then it can stand on its own. And then we can postulate other, reasons for why moral values exist. And Maverick Christian put in, he says, seems pretty hard to reasonably deny that objective morality exists. Would the Nazis be right if they killed, brainwashed all who disagreed with them? What would you say to that?
Well, this is an argument that Craig gives. So I find that the moral, so I mentioned that I find the Christological argument or the resurrection argument to be the most interesting. I find that can lead to quite productive discussions. Unfortunately, I often find the moral argument can lead to the least productive discussions because there's, I don't really know why. Maybe it's so emotionally charged or it's so difficult for people to understand different perspectives. I don't know why. I've just found it difficult in the past to kind of feel like one can make any progress here. So there's sort of what I'll call two main views about morality, right? Which you can call moral realism or moral anti-realism. Moral realism would be the view that there's something like objective moral values, to put it simply, which is what Craig thinks. And then there's an alternative view would be anti-realism, that there is no such thing. I mean, there are other views, but I'm just going to simplify it for our purposes here. So Craig is saying that if you are a moral realist, you have to be a theist. Basically, that's his argument, and that you should be a moral realist, therefore you should be a theist. So, as you pointed out just before, I think that there's a big problem with just the structure of Craig's argument, because suppose that you're really committed to moral realism, like you just really think that is true, then why would you accept Craig's, I guess it's his first premise. Why would you accept that it depends on God? Because I'm just going to say, well, if I'm really committed to moral realism, but then I don't believe in God, then I'm not just going to give up moral realism. I'm going to give up assuming that it depends on God. I'm going to find another way to understand it. If I'm really committed to that. So I think that's why I ask in the book, like, why would an atheist moral realist ever agree with Craig's, with that premise that morality depends on God? Because they're just committed to two claims that are contrary to that. So they're just going to always reject that premise. And now that leads to your question about, well, how do we understand morality then? Well, I mean, sometimes I don't like doing this, but I think sorry, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I see. I'm kind of coming from a different position, because I would agree with premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. And I will, I stand really firm in that, because if this all came about by just an accident, we are all just, and especially if you're a materialist, if you only believe that what exists is the natural world, then how can anybody, any cosmic accident, possibly tell another cosmic accident what is good or bad? Now, you could take 7 billion cosmic accidents and they could tell me that it's wrong for me to go and shoot up a bunch of school children, and they could put me in jail for it, right? Because they have more power than me. But they don't have any power to tell me that that was wrong. They don't have, because all they are is a collection of molecules that happen to come together in the right place. So they have no real value, and they have no ability to speak to me about what is right or wrong. So I'm not saying moral values objectively exist. I think that's a weak argument. But I'm saying if God does not exist, there is no moral difference between shooting up a schoolyard of children and, being Mother Teresa and helping homeless people on the street. There is no moral difference between those actions, because nothing matters. Nothing is important. You're a cosmic accident. I'm a cosmic accident. And, all you can do is just eke out the most enjoyment you can get out of life until you die. So What do you
So
think?
that is similar to Craig's argument because he says basically everything you've said, although he
Right.
also argues that we should very strongly endorse moral realism. So maybe like kind of irrespective of the other premise, which I think is part of a weakness there. But so let's focus on what you've said then.
Okay.
Maybe we can make a bit of progress here because I don't really understand. Like, I don't even know that that's an argument so much as a bunch of assertions. So maybe we can try to understand each other's positions a bit more here. So let's take the cosmic accident perspective there. So why? Because I don't understand why we would think that just because humanity, like humanity, the planet Earth, came together by accident, we just mean like absent design, like no
like by natural process.
Natural process. So why would we think that implies that there's no morality? I'm not sure what the connection is there. Because morality is about things being right or wrong or good or bad. Why does that follow from things being an accident?
No. Why would there be good or bad? Like if you're asserting that something is good or bad.
Sorry, go ahead.
If you're asserting that something is good or bad, you've got to tell me how something is good or bad. So what makes it good or bad?
Yeah, okay. So that was the question I was about to answer, but it just, so you were making the claim that if humanity came about as an accident, there couldn't be morality. Now, we could ask the question, well, what is morality? Like, could it have come about could there be morality even though we're an accident, or maybe not? Like, you can ask the question. That's a good question. But it seems like you're actually asserting, no, it can't. And so that's what I was asking, well, why should we think that?
Well,
because if you think that, it may rule out certain answers that I'd be inclined to give, right? So that's one of the reasons that I'm interested to understand why would we think that one rules out the other. Because I would say they have nothing to do with each other. Where we came from is irrelevant from my point of view as to whether morality exists or like is objective.
Okay. Well, I think it has everything to do with it because I don't see how matter assembling itself through a process of just random time and chance can have meaning. And so it can have the illusion of meaning. It can have the illusion of being something worthwhile. But in reality, it's only an illusion because it's simply the product of time and chance.
Yeah, but why is it that something, well, I don't know if meaning is exactly the same, but let's just say moral value or points in that sense, because meaning might be a little bit different.
Okay, moral value. But,
yeah. Again, I'm just not quite sure. So, I mean, if you see, I don't know, Nazi example was used, so we can go back to that. The Nazis torture people, causing them pain. I think that pain is pretty bad. Why does it matter? So your argument is that pain is bad if someone created us to feel pain, but not if we just feel pain because of a series of natural processes. Now, to me, the pain is bad because it's pain, because of the way it is, because of the way the experience is, not because of not because of its causal antecedents. Like, that doesn't make sense to me because it's the thing itself that's bad. It's not something outside of it, like what caused it. So I don't understand the relevance of why humans came to be in a particular way.
Well, I would say pain is uncomfortable, but it's not bad. Pain is,
why not?
It's morally irrelevant because it makes you uncomfortable, but you have no moral value. So why does anyone care if it makes you uncomfortable?
Well, I think we're combining a few issues here because so some people think that moral, so there's a view called moral internalism, which would be saying that to believe that something is morally good or morally right implies that we'll be motivated to act in accordance with it. Now, I don't believe in that. So that means that I believe that you can believe, too many beliefs there. I believe that people can be aware of moral facts or moral values, but not be motivated to act in accordance with them. So you've asked about why should people care? That's a bit of a different question because that, like, I don't actually see
why
what
should
work that
people
does, right?
say it is good or bad?
Well,
because good implies that there's a moral difference between pain or not pain. So yeah, sorry if I'm muddying it up by using slightly different terms. I'll try to stick with the terms. Like,
yeah, no, it's just about clarity, right? Because the question of why care is, I think, a different question. The reason I mentioned moral internalism is because some people would say that they're related, well, they're like the same, but I don't think that they are. But so people may not care, right? But that doesn't. So I mean, I could tell you something that's true and you may not care, but whether you care or not doesn't change whether it's true. So I think we can agree that whether people care about it is not plausibly it's not the same as whether there's a fact of the matter about it. So my claim is that morality, I mean, I'm a moral realist. I do think that there are objective moral values. I think that I believe in inherent moral values or intrinsic. I don't distinguish those terms, which means that particular states of affairs have moral value or more or less morally valuable, or just better or worse, morally good or morally bad, as determined by the properties or attributes of those states of affairs. So, for example, a person in pain is just objectively morally bad, perhaps unless there's a morally sufficient reason to justify that. But like assuming that that's just in and of itself, like torturing for fun is the classic example. Well, that's just objectively morally bad. I think that that's just what we mean. Not what we mean. That's just what it is for something to be bad, is essentially for people to suffer, whereas people flourishing is morally good. And that is an inherent property of just people. I think animals as well, but again, just focus on people and the way we are. Some states are bad for us. They cause suffering, they cause pain, they cause hardship. Or I guess they are pain and hardship. And others are good for us. They lead to flourishing, happiness, fulfillment, all that good stuff. That's what morality is, in my view. Well, morality is about promoting those at a social level. It's not just individual, it's social. And there's more to work out there. There have been lots of accounts developed in the philosophical literature about this and the field of metaethics. So different philosophers have different things to say about this. Any particular thing that I say, there'll be philosophers who say, no, it works differently. But most philosophers are both naturalists and moral realists, and so agree with me broadly that it's unclear, I think, why the fact that humans came to be without, say, divine guidance is relevant to whether it's appropriate to describe, or whether it is the case that certain states of being for humans are good and certain states are bad. So I'm still not quite understanding why you think very strongly that God needed to have an intention for us to be this way in order for it to matter, like, morally speaking, what way it is.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's suppose I'm a sadist. So what brings me enjoyment is seeing other people in pain. So for me, pain, other people having pain is my highest value, right? So how can anyone tell me that that is bad?
That causing other people pain for your enjoyment is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they could
they can tell you it's bad because it is bad.
But they could put me in jail. They could say you're a danger to society, right? But they couldn't actually tell me that this is wrong or bad.
Well, why not?
Because
if it is bad, then they can tell you that. If it causes suffering to people without morally sufficient reason, then they can say, hey, that's bad. So what's the problem?
Who are they and why should I listen to them? They're just a collection of molecules that's happened to assemble together in just the right way so that they think and talk. But all of their ideas don't weigh on the scale at all. I mean,
so do you think that we can have any true beliefs if we are an accident? Because that might be a more fundamental question then. Because maybe if none of our beliefs can be true, then obviously we can't have then we can't assert moral claims, because they're a subset of beliefs, right?
Well,
like, what about mathematical truths? If I give you a mathematical proof and I say, look, you should believe this conclusion based on these sets of premises, and you just say, why should I believe you? You're just, an accident of evolution. Like, well, I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to say to that. I don't see the relevance of where I came from if the reasoning is sound. But I mean, maybe that person cares, so I'm not going to persuade them. So.
Yeah, well, I guess, and I'd have to think about that one, but I do think that, that kind of gets into the consciousness issue, which is another, I think, evidence for God. But like, I haven't really thought about that one. Like, does that mean that I guess there's a difference between the description of the world, so like a mathematical concept, than a moral judgment, like a value judgment about what is, worthwhile and what is not, what is good, what is bad.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, they're not precisely analogous. That's why it's an analogy. But I would say that there are important things in common. So one is that if you're a moral realist, that you believe that there are moral facts of the matter, like objective truths. analogous to mathematical truths, if not being precisely the same. So that's the reason because you were asking like, well, why should I believe them? Like, well, why should you believe anyone when they say anything? And so maybe if we're just accidents, then you should never believe anyone when they say anything. So that would be a broader case. It's not specific to morality. So that's one point. But the other point I would make is that normativity is not limited. Normativity is like shouldness, essentially. Normativity is not restricted to morality. There are many types of normativity. There's normativity in a legal sense, for example, or there's normativity in within the context of like restricted settings, like a game, for example, like you should do this because it's good in the game. But there's also epistemic normativity, at least many people believe that there is, as in you rationally should believe this because of the reasons that I give or the evidences that I give. Like if you say to someone 3 + 3 = 6, and you make sure they understand what 3 means and what 6 means and what plus means and equals, and they understand the concepts, right? And then you say, well, do you believe that 3 + 3 = 6? They say, no, not really. I don't see why. And you're like, but I've given you the reasons. You should believe it. And they're like, no, I don't see why. I think that what we're appealing to there is a notion of epistemic ought, or epistemic normativity, an idea that someone ought to do something or believe something, I guess, on the basis of a certain set of norms. They're epistemic norms. I think that's I'm not saying it's the same thing as moral normativity, but I think it's analogous as a different example of normativity. Now, there are some people who think that you can't have any type of normativity, probably some people in chat, that you can't have any type of normativity under naturalism. I actually don't really see the issue here, but that's a longer discussion that we would have to have. I'm just pointing out that I do think there are different types of normativity, and I think that a lot of the concerns about the moral argument are not really restricted to moral concerns per se, but they're more about the notion of normativity. And then the question is that we'd have to ask is, what accounts can naturalists give about normativity and how it might work? What accounts can theists give? And does postulating theism give us any explanatory advantage in understanding normativity? And my position is that I don't think it does give us theism does give us any explanatory advantage. Obviously, that's a longer discussion we'd have to have. I've not been persuaded by the arguments that I've heard. And I would add that there's a lot of work in the philosophical literature by mostly naturalists, not exclusively, about how to understand these things without appealing to God. And where I feel somewhat frustrated sometimes, I'm not from your end because this isn't really your jam, I understand that, but is when people make these confident assertions about that you just can't understand normativity without God or something like that, with very little insight or awareness of all of what's being discussed by philosophers trying to think about this. It's fine, like you don't have to agree with them, obviously, like you can point out the problems, right? But at least we should, I think, engage with that and not just sort of ignore it. Again, I'm not really directing that at you, but that's just
you pointed that out in your book.
Yes, exactly.
And I agree that, like, if moral values exist, if objective moral values exist, then you're right about that these ideas that have been presented should be evaluated. I'm just not convinced that moral objective values can exist without God.
Sure.
So, Maverick Christian says, I think one key problem is that moral wrongness, if it exists, is non-natural. It doesn't seem like the sort of thing that is likely to exist if atheism is true. That's a really good point. So, why does this thing called moral value exist if atheism is true?
Yes. So we have to be careful when we talk about natural and non-natural here, because unfortunately the usage is not entirely consistent in the philosophical literature.
Okay. So, got it. Okay.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that question. I'm just making the clarification for a reason I'm about to explain, because in the field of meta-ethics, which deals with the foundations of morality, there's at least two versions of moral realism. Remember, moral realism is the position that there are objective moral values or something like that, right? But there are different ways you can understand this. Now, one way is called ethical naturalism. There's another way that's called ethical non-naturalism. Now, the confusing part is that people who call themselves ethical non-naturalists, like I think G.E. Moore would be one example of that for people who are somewhat familiar with this. Peter Singer, I think, also puts himself in this category. By non-naturalism, they don't really mean like supernaturalism. They just mean something like, confess I'm not an expert here. I don't quite know what they mean, but something like an abstract object, I think. Something like a mathematical or logical truth. Something that can be determined through reason and that doesn't refer to anything like in the physical universe. That's the sense in which they mean that it's not natural. I think the best comparison is like something like logical numbers. Those aren't like concrete things in the universe. They're sort of abstract. And so they think morality is kind of like that. And so that morality arises out of sort of very fundamental concerns about the notion of like agency and perspectival invariance or different things like that. I'm not going to try to explain that in detail here, partly because it's not my area of expertise, but there's lots of views there. Now, so people like that would agree with the Maverick Christian who said that morality is non-natural. They would say yes, and then they would understand it in their terms, but they don't think that you need to appeal to God. Now, there's a different set of views or perspective, which is what I subscribe to, called ethical naturalism. Ethical naturalists think that morality isn't kind of like maths and logic. It's more like science, not literally, but in the sense that morality arises from like actual concrete things that exist in the world. So basically like facts of pleasure and pain and suffering and flourishing about humans is loosely how I describe it, and other beings as well. And so these are different like to numbers and logic and so forth that are abstract. These are like concrete physical things. And so ethical naturalists think that basically morality is a higher order type of property, say like the weather or wetness or other examples are given. It's not something you can like see under a microscope because it's not that sort of thing. It's complicated, but it emerges out of the way humans work and interact with each other. And so we tell a story about how we think that works. And then obviously other people criticize that. I mean, the reason I ask about, because it depends what you think about morality. Some people think that morality just must be some sort of transcendental, must be something transcendental, and so ethical naturalism is just not going to get started if that's what you think. But then the question is, well, what reasons are there to think that, and how do accounts that appeal to transcendental sources of morality compare to naturalistic accounts? And we can have that discussion. But again, my view is that that's always how, generally how we should proceed in these discussions. It's like, well, what does one person think morality is? How do they address these questions? What does another person think? Let's compare those theories and see, which one we think are better.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and there's a lot of good comments in the chat and a lot of good questions. But I'm sorry, guys, I can't put everything up. But I did see that Maverick Christian says he has an argument about this, and I want to just promote Maverick Christian's channel and tell you guys to go to that. He does a, beautiful job. He is, great at philosophy. And so please do go check out his channel. And thank you for everyone who is asking questions. So I wanted to ask you, James, and just kind of go now, kind of turn it to a more like personal level about your life. Like, sure. What are things that are important to you?
Oh, that's a deep question. Let's see. What are things important to me? So truth is important. And I would say justice, but I also think suffering is important. Maybe I phrased that the wrong way. Maybe I should say flourishing is important, but reducing suffering maybe would be a better way to say it. That's a strong driver for me as well. I think that connects strongly to truth, because I think that, I don't want to reify truth as it's like some big, capital T thing that's out there. I just mean like understanding the way things are. That's all I mean by that. I think understanding the way things are helps us a lot to make things better. It's not sufficient. You do have to have empathy. So that's another thing that I do value. But it certainly helps a lot. And I think a lot of things that have happened over the course of history because of people misunderstanding things, including, I'll give this example. I think Nazism is actually a good example of this. People had a lot of wrong views about the nature of like race and ethnicity. And although rectifying those views wouldn't have changed everything, I think it would have actually made a difference for a lot of people with regard to the plausibility of those ideas. So I think that understanding the world correctly is a big factor here. So yeah, what have I said? I've said sort of truth, understanding things. I've said empathy. I've said suffering or reducing suffering, promoting flourishing. Curiosity, I guess it's related to truth, but maybe a little bit different. Yeah, I don't know if that's sort of what you were asking for at that level of abstraction, but those are a few things that come to mind.
Cool. Well, you said truth is important, and I know that
I should add friendship. That's another one. Friendship.
Cool. You said truth is important, and I know that like you really enjoy philosophy. So what kind of what truth have you discovered through like your study in philosophy?
What have I discovered?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing would be philosophy is very difficult to do well. I guess it's easy to do badly, but I don't pretend to be a world-class philosopher by any means, but I do have an interest, obviously, and I think a respect for philosophy done well, which doesn't mean philosophy you agree with necessarily, but there's a set of standards for I think how to evaluate what's good, and so I appreciate that. So that's one thing. Another thing I appreciate is disagreement. Actually, so this is one of the big ideas that influences a lot of my thinking. A disagreement between people who are well informed about a subject. So I mean, pretty much anything, especially in philosophy, although outside there as well, but especially in philosophy, pretty much anything that you can think of, whatever you think about it, there's someone who knows more about it and has thought more about it that disagrees with you, like on both sides, pretty much. And I think that's quite sobering. At least for me, I think that people should take this a lot more seriously. Actually, it's one of the reasons why I give that 10% figure. Because if I was just to rely on my own judgment, I'd give a much lower figure. But I have to. I think that I have to incorporate the fact that there are very thoughtful, intelligent people who disagree with me on that. And that shapes a lot of my perspectives on a lot of things, actually, and I think pushes me towards epistemic humility about a lot of things, which doesn't mean I don't have my own views and I don't defend them, but I think that we always need to exercise a lot of caution before making very firm statements about things in philosophy because of the extent of the disagreement. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to mention one more thing, which is maybe a bit more substantive than those, which is that. I think I've been, how to put this? I mean, I guess this will sound like just confirming my biases, but I guess that's where they come from, right? I've been impressed by some of the accounts that people have developed to understand things that are very complicated and difficult in naturalistic terms, essentially. So looking into morality, for example, and causation would be another thing. There's different areas of philosophy that address different questions. And in general, I've been impressed with some of the different accounts that have been given in different spheres, which have, I think, bolstered my confidence to some extent. Obviously, restrained by the disagreement aspect, but nevertheless, I think that it's that we actually can account for quite a lot of things without needing to appeal to God or spirits or anything outside of the natural order. And for me, as someone who's very interested in science and thinks about things from a scientific lens, typically, I think that there's a great synergy between the science and philosophy, at least done well, I would say. I'm hoping actually to write a book about this, about how I sort of a synthesis of a sort of a scientific, philosophical naturalism minded worldview. So that's something that I've been struck with more recently.
Well, now this is curious to me that, you were talking about taking into consideration that other people's perspectives, experience, ideas, and that's why you put it at 10%, because you're incorporating what other people have said, rather than just your own idea, which would be lower. Am I characterizing that correctly? You would say,
yes,
I mean,
yes.
your idea about the existence of God, the chances of the existence of God, and you would put it lower. But okay, maybe I'm confusing the situation.
No, that's right.
Okay, the question I'm wanting to ask is, because I find it strange that it seems that to be someone who doesn't believe in the spiritual realm, or that really adheres to naturalism and does not believe in the existence of things outside of the natural world that we observe, that seems to me to be quite dismissive of the majority of human experience. So are you taking into account the experience of the majority of humans who have lived and died and believed in things like God or gods, angels, demons, having spiritual experiences and things that go beyond, miracles, and this is one point in your book that I sent you an email about it, which I thought your argument about the resurrection was good, but there was one weakness in it. And that was when you were talking about the mass hallucinations and other accounts of resurrection and miracles and stuff. You kind of assumed that those were false, assumed that those events were mass hallucinations. When I read them, I think maybe that did happen. So how do I know that that, what you're attributing as a mass hallucination, how do I know that that didn't happen? Because in my worldview, things like that do happen. Miracles do happen. So are you dismissing like all of the human testimony about these supernatural things?
So just to clarify, I think what you're referring to is the fact that in the chapter about the resurrection, I appeal to cases from a wide range of traditions and different time periods about collective religious experiences and other such phenomena. And in giving the argument, I don't know exactly what I state about this, but I'm sort of presenting them as if they're not veridical, as a counter to the idea that, well, if these aren't veridical, then we should be skeptical about the ones, the Christian claims about the resurrection. But what you're saying is, well, maybe a lot of them are veridical. Is that kind of the idea?
What does veridical mean?
Oh, I used that word to be...
You probably used it in the book, but I don't remember.
Yeah, no, it's not actually a very good word. I'm just deliberately being a bit of weasel here. Well, the experience, let's just say that the experience is something supernatural or beyond the natural world for our purposes here. What is that kind of what you're getting at? That a lot of these things could be like that?
Yeah, when I read these accounts, and you did a really good job of, researching and bringing in like miracle accounts, or like supposed miracle accounts or supernatural.
Well, they're miracle accounts. Yeah, they're accounts of miracles. Yeah,
right. But like you were like using those as evidence that, hey, people can have mass hallucinations, right?
Yes.
But to me, you didn't support that because you assumed that they were mass hallucinations. You didn't prove to me that they were hallucinations.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying. Yes. So there's a reason that I did it that way. Well, there's a couple of things here. I don't like the term mass hallucination. I prefer collective religious experience or collective experience just broadly, because I think hallucination is a private phenomenon. But that's just a terminological thing. It's not super important here. But the other issue is that I'm sort of assuming my audience, I guess you could say. I'm assuming that many of the Christians who want to use this argument or appeal to this argument are not going to accept. They may accept some of the claims that I appeal to, but I sort of deliberately pick claims that fall outside of Protestant Christianity. And the reason I did that is because I'm assuming that, well, I don't think it's an assumption. I know that a lot of people that are interested in this sort of argument, like Protestant Christians, that people I've typically interacted with, are not going to accept miracles from different, like even Catholicism, but also Hindu traditions or other Jewish Messianic traditions and other sorts of cases that I present there. Now, I'm not saying that that's incumbent on them or you or anyone else to think that. That is just, I guess, a decision that I've made as the method of presentation. So, but to respond to your substantive point about, well, how can you just dismiss these? I think I want to come back to what I said before about the word veridical. I mean, it has its uses, but I do think it's problematic in these cases because, and also to your question about, aren't I dismissing their experiences? I don't believe that I'm doing that. I mean, I suppose I may come across as dismissive sometimes. I don't intend to be. The reason is because I think one has to carefully distinguish an experience or like a phenomenon, a memory or a report from the causes of that, whatever brought it about, whatever made it the case that happened, right? Whatever's underlying it. And I think the idea of veridical is that so let me take a step back for a second. So someone can tell us they saw a ghost, they saw God, whatever. Unless we think that they're deliberately making it up, then we're going to say, well, they had that experience, right? And usually I don't think that people make these things up. It may happen sometimes, but I don't think that's the usual case. In that case, like there was an experience. They experienced something. That's not really deniable, right? So then the question is, what did they experience or what happened? What is the explanation for that experience? And that's a very important question. And that's something I think that atheists have often been pretty flippant about, not being willing to actually think about, well, what does cause these experiences? Why do they happen? Why do people report this? So that I think is important. Now, the issue then is in taking the experiences seriously, I need to take seriously what they're reporting to me and how that affects them and so forth. That I need to take seriously and accept basically what they say they experienced and how it affects them and so forth. But what I don't need to do, and I think what we shouldn't do, is accept their explanation for why they had that experience. And that relates to the sort of veridical question. I think veridical here means that we have a story about why they had the experience or what caused it. And the experience is veridical if it actually points to or it sort of really reflects that underlying cause. But to me, that's a bit hazy here because it's really a question as to what is the best explanation of their experience. At least that's how I think we should think about it. Because saying that something's veridical sort of assumes that there's like a correct account, and we just ask, like, is the experience they had reflective of the thing that really exists or not? Whereas I'm not sure that there's anything that like exists beyond the experience. I'm like, that's the question, right? What is the best explanation of the experience? So there could be different explanations. Maybe the angel Gabriel really appeared to the Prophet Muhammad. Maybe it was a demon fooling him. Maybe it was an alien doing it for laughs. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe it was something else, right? So these are different explanations of that experience. All of them, I think, should take that experience and report seriously, and not just say, oh, he just made it up or whatever. But we can give different accounts as to the origin of it or why it happened. And then we have to assess those accounts, which is more plausible based on, the typical factors we use for this. And my argument is that I think I have a better explanation for these type of experiences that does not require appealing to anything beyond the natural world.
Cool. What is like your main explanation for these experiences?
Well, yeah, actually, this is something that I've been thinking about trying to explain more clearly, because I made a decision about how to articulate this in the book, which I think that, it has its benefits and downsides. But what I think is that the same processes that I appeal to, I think I mentioned this a couple of times, but I could have been clearer. The same processes that I appeal to explain the resurrection appearances and the phenomena around there, I think can be used to explain, at least in general terms, other accounts of supernormal or paranormal events. Now, the thing is, the details are obviously going to differ, and we don't always have the details in other cases. Like, we don't know exactly who reported what when, and exactly who saw what at which, and who was present. Things like that can be a bit confused. So we can't necessarily recreate a videotape of what happened. And that's, I think, sometimes I think people ask for too much we just don't have enough information. But I think we can give a general series of explanations. So the phenomena that I appeal to in my RHBS model, well, the reburial is obviously specific to the resurrection. That's not going to be relevant in other cases. But the other things are so private hallucinations. So B stands for biases. So that's psychological biases and distortions. RHBS. So S is then socialization. So that would include collective experiences of of what I call paranormal or supernormal or supernatural events. And I won't really be able to give it justice here, but I discuss in my book the variety of, I think, findings from psychology and from sociology and similar disciplines about how these sorts of phenomena occur and how they can be combined, a combination of hallucinations, memory contamination, cognitive distortions, selective validation of experiences, socialization in a particular context, cognitive dissonance, other factors like this combined together to give rise to reports of in a community of having these sorts of experiences. So in my book, I apply that specifically to the resurrection accounts because that's what I'm interested in responding to. But I think that you can take the same ingredients, and this is something I think I'd like to write a bit more on to flesh this out. I think you can take the same ingredients and apply it to other cases as well, like Muhammad or Joseph Smith or other Messiah claimants or various gurus from India and so forth that have these other miracle claims. And I think you can use that to account for their experiences. Now, that doesn't. It's important to understand that what I'm saying is that these. I think that we can explain the experiences without having to appeal to anything else. This doesn't prove that there's nothing else that's causing the experience. It doesn't prove that there's no supernatural. All that I can claim is that we don't need to invoke anything beyond the natural world to account for why the experiences happen. But it doesn't mean that you can't believe that there is. It's just that the argument that we need to infer that there is, I don't think works, because I think we can explain them through other means. It's important to understand that, because I think there can be a misunderstanding that I'm saying my account shows that the resurrection couldn't have happened, but all I think it shows is that we don't need to infer that God rose Jesus from the dead to explain the evidence that we do have.
I gotcha. And I agree with you. I think, what you're saying is a good perspective. You're not dismissing people's experiences out of hand. You're just trying to find the best interpretation for their experience. So you're not necessarily believing their interpretation of their experience, but You're not just, dismissing them altogether. So yeah, I had somewhere I wanted to go after this, but now I can't remember. Yeah. So, oh well, okay, it's gone. So let's just, since I can't remember what I wanted to say about that, let's go to, I just want to be like, for the science, well, people who are interested in science, just wanted to talk about something you mentioned in your book that I find interesting. And, I know a little bit about it, but I want to hear it from you because you actually, have a degree in physics. And you were talking about in your book how, like, quantum theory and like basically general relativity and everything, like things don't quite go together. They don't fit together. Like they, I can read the
quantum mechanics and general relativity, you mean?
Yes. So
yeah, that's right.
Can you talk about that? Can you tell us how these two things are, kind of contradictory in a sense?
Oh, well, this is not my area of expertise, but I can make some general comments. So,
okay.
So I suppose we should go back about 100 years to Einstein. where else would you start? And Einstein was thinking about quite a few different problems. One of the problems that he was thinking about was the nature of basically the nature of light and how it works. And he was imagining things like traveling along a photon as it moves around, and what that would look like, and how things change as you sort of change your velocity. And his thoughts there led to the development of first special and then general relativity, which is a theory that describes essentially how energy and mass bends space-time, and how then space-time responds to that. And you can, in order to predict fully accurately the, say, orbits of some of the planets or the motion of matter in the galaxies and so forth, we actually need to use general relativity as a theory for explaining the motion of things. So things don't just travel along straight lines, as Newton said, but they actually, they do travel along straight lines, but through curved space. So to us, it looks like they sort of don't always travel in a straight line, to put it very simply. But that really applies at the scale of things that are like very large and over long time spans, like planets, stars, galaxies, and so forth, the universe as a whole. So that was one sort of one, I guess, branch of modern physics. Now, the other thing that Einstein was thinking about was the behavior of essentially atoms and electrons, the two particular phenomena called the Brownian motion and the photoelectric effect, which I probably didn't go into here, but he was trying to understand particular phenomena of how like electrons interact with light and other things like that. And this, some of the things that he proposed there and subsequent developments led to what we now call quantum mechanics. And this is the theory of the very small, that applies to looking at like individual electrons and individual particles, atoms, things like that. So a very small scale. Again, we think of things in the classical world in a certain way, like an object has a particular position, and then to move over there, it has to travel through the intervening space. But that's not really how things work on a quantum mechanical level. Things don't have definite positions a lot of the time, and they don't have to like travel from here to there by passing through all the intermittent places. They essentially exist as like a probability cloud. So there's lots of weird stuff that happens at the quantum scale. Now, the issue is that those are kind of like the two branches of modern physics, if you like. And we don't have a very good way of reconciling these. There are ways people have attempted to try to quantize general relativity, but for technical reasons, and I don't admit full understanding of this, but they don't work. And so we currently don't know how to describe gravity at a quantum level, which means like how do gravitational effects manifest in very small time, like very small space. Now, most of the time this doesn't matter because gravity is very weak. So that's why you only typically see its effects like with planets and like very large objects. But the issue, it becomes relevant when you go back to the very, very early universe, because at that point, the universe was extremely dense and like hot and dense and very compacted. And in that context, gravity becomes important at a quantum scale. And this is very important and kind of connects to some of the other things we've been talking about, because in order to really understand how the universe came to be in the very early moments just after the Big Bang, or possibly even before the Big Bang, if there was such a thing, then we need to understand how gravity works at a quantum level. And this has been what physicists have been working on for like, well, I don't know, since Einstein really, but certainly for the last like 60 years or probably more than that, to try to develop a quantum theory of gravity. So this is where things like string theory, loop quantum gravity, the holographic principle, if people have watched some of Inspiring Philosophy's videos, they're all kind of relevant to try to address this question. And so, yeah, we still don't really have a clear answer to this. There are different theories. One of the problems is that none of them are really experimentally testable, because they're they only can be tested at very high energy levels, and we don't have the particle accelerators that are big enough to do that. So yeah, that's a short answer to that question.
Cool. I mean, and guys, if you like, James has like amazing explanations on the Science of Everything podcast. I listened to a couple of them. It's great. And he has some of the things from his research with mice. And so it's very cool.
Oh, yeah.
There's quite a bunch of different topics that he addresses. So totally go and subscribe to that. Check that out. James, what fulfills you in life? So I asked what's important to you, but what fulfills you? What makes you happy?
That's a tricky one. I mean, honestly, I'd probably just give most of the same answers. Maybe I'll be a little more specific. So I really like doing my podcast and the research for that. I get periodic feedback from my listeners. Sometimes I just say, hey, I really like the podcast, but some people will sometimes tell me stories like, I think I had one from a truck driver who was saying that, well, they never got to go to college, but they like to listen to my podcast while they're like on long drives and stuff like that to learn about science and stuff. And, things like that, which is really rewarding to hear, because that's the reason was one of the main reasons I make it, is so that people can learn about things, hopefully in a bit of a more accessible way than some other resources. So I like doing that. And I guess more broadly, I like to try to communicate ideas and help people understand things better. Like resolve confusions, or at least reduce them, and point people to better ways of thinking. So that's what I like to think that I do with like my book and blog and my YouTube videos as well, to some extent. So I find that quite fulfilling. And a related thing that I like to do is discuss things with, or like have meaningful discussions with anyone, not anyone, with anyone who's willing to, engage with the norms of polite discourse. Essentially, there are some people that are a bit toxic, but particularly with people that I know, like friends, which I find very rewarding as well, and just stimulating, and gets me thinking about new things and understanding other perspectives better. So I really enjoy doing that. I also like playing computer games, but I don't know that. Well, it can be fulfilling. Like if you, I guess I like sort of fiction in a way in the sense of like putting yourself in another world, like Lord of the Rings, for example, has a very well developed world building and fantasy setting, and I like kind of being able to immerse yourself in a different world with different rules, and just kind of enjoy that as an aesthetic experience. And it can be an intellectual experience as well, because it can help you to think about other assumptions you can make. So I enjoy that as well.
Who's your favorite Star Trek captain?
Movies. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Star Trek.
Who's your favorite?
I'd probably say Picard.
Oh my gosh, Picard. No, not Picard. We're against Picard in our family, but what's your favorite Star Trek series?
Yeah, we're actually I'm rewatching Next Generation at the moment with some of my family, because we got it on Blu-ray. They remastered it a few years ago. It's so I'm really enjoying that. But I've only watched Deep Space Nine once, and I'd quite like to rewatch that to give a fair assessment. So honestly, probably one of those two. I quite like all of the classic Trek, so pre 2009. I don't go for the newer stuff, but yeah, I think they're all quite good. I mean, obviously there are some bad episodes, but overall, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think Deep Space Nine is probably my favorite. So, yeah.
I think it's probably the most sophisticated Trek series. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maverick Christian has some recommendations. Whoops, that's not the right one. Duet. I'm sorry, my eyes are and In the Pale Moonlight. Cool.
Yeah, I need to rewatch DS9. It's been a while.
Yeah. Cool. I remembered the question I wanted to ask you about basically my question about how you interpret, people's experiences. Why do you prefer a natural explanation? Like, what causes you personally to take a naturalistic interpretation rather than a supernatural one?
That's almost a psychological question as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why. I think this is actually interesting as well. I'm interested in the cognitive sort of science and psychological aspect of why people disagree. Like, why do people read the same stuff and not have the same opinions? Obviously, well, different upbringing and experiences, but like, what are the specifics of that? I don't know that we really know. I mean, I wasn't raised as a naturalist, so I don't know that I actually thought a lot about this stuff growing up. I was interested in I became interested in philosophy around my mid-teenage years, but I didn't really know that much about it at that point, and that was still while I was a Mormon, if you count those as Christians. I think that they do count. But anyway, so why am I so enamored with sort of naturalistic scientific explanations now? I don't know. Obviously, I can give my reasons as to why I think that they're persuasive, but I feel like that's not exactly the question you're asking. I think one thing that I do like is I'm a fan of ontological simplicity. So I feel like most people agree that the natural world exists. There are some who disagree, like idealists, but most people do think it exists. And so the question is there anything beyond that? And I guess I'm kind of just interested in the project of, do we need anything beyond that to make sense of the world? And a lot of people throughout history have thought that we do for various reasons. And I sort of, like I said before, I think that scientific understanding, and I would also say philosophical understanding, has reached a point where I'm not convinced that we do. Not to say that we've solved all problems, but I don't know that we need to postulate anything more than that. But I think that at a more personal level, I mean, obviously, I'm really interested in science, so I naturally approach questions in a scientific kind of reductionist way. And I notice that is different because a lot of people don't think about things naturally in that way. So that's obviously going to, I guess you could call that a bias, or a perspective. I probably prefer. I don't exactly know why I have that perspective. That's just sort of how I think about things. I like to break things down into like small concrete pieces and try to have a system for putting them back together. That's a kind of a scientific way to think about things. Honestly, I don't know that I don't think theism really fits that framework very well. I suppose some may disagree, but a lot of people have said that God is not material. God doesn't have parts. God isn't something that we can just understand in the way that we understand, things in the natural world. So, I think that is a fairly traditional understanding of God as being quite different to this sort of approach. And so maybe naturally it just doesn't fit very well with the way I think about things. And so that's why I don't think it's a good explanation. So that's a bit of internal psychological analysis. I think to add to that, other people do, maybe a lot of people, I don't know, but do quite like personal explanations. If you say that this happened because someone wanted it to happen, that just is a lot more persuasive to them. Obviously there's a place for that, right? But I think other people are more willing to expand that to like cosmic levels or other sorts of stories where, to me, again, a reductive science type explanation is a lot more convivial. Just sort of seems better to me. And of course I have my reason for saying why I prefer it, right? But I'm just trying to dig into that a little bit more. So yeah, there's definitely psychological factors that affect these sorts of things. And I don't pretend to be immune to that. But that's one of the reasons it's important to talk to people who have different views to try to understand how it makes sense to them.
Right. Okay. So do you often talk to people who have supernatural experiences and understand their perspective?
I don't think I know a lot of people personally who report having those sorts of experiences. I have quite a lot of people who believe in the supernatural in various ways. But yeah, I don't know why that is. I don't necessarily have. I don't have an aversion to. I think there've been a few people that I've known who report that sort of thing. Perhaps it's. I mean, I don't know if this is right or not, but perhaps it's because some of the people who are more into the experiential side of Christianity aren't as into the intellectual side, and I'm naturally attracted to that and like go into groups and chat about stuff, and that's not really their thing. Like, I don't know if that's the main reason. I'm not averse to it, but it can be difficult if the sorts of questions that I'm interested in asking are just not the sort of questions they're interested in addressing. Then maybe they just wouldn't have a lot to say to me. So I don't know.
Okay, cool.
I'm not averse to talking to people. I just want to clarify. I'm not averse to people to talking to people who have those experiences. But I think that I would be frustrated with people who, I mean, I guess that there are different traditions who would advocate this, but I mean, to me, I'm just not the sort of person who can just say, could just let the intellectual question be unaddressed. Like, well, how do you understand what you're experiencing? I would ask them, like, well, how do you understand this? Like, well, why does it work that way? This kind of thing. And I'm quite interested in listening to what they have to say. But if they kind of just don't really care about thinking about those things, then I guess that does frustrate me a bit. Like, well, how can you not? Like, that's important, surely, at the very least. Like, I don't know. So that I might find a bit frustrating for people who just sort of don't want to engage in that side of it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I hope you find some good people to dialogue with that will answer your question in, ways that are satisfying. So this has been so much fun. Do you have anything else that you want to share just in general about your life, about your work, or about your book?
Let's see. Anything? I mean, we've been pretty comprehensive here. Maybe I'll just add a little addendum. So I'm very interested in the intersection of science and philosophy. I actually see them as more of a continuum rather than sort of discrete categories. So I'm interested, hopefully I'd be able to be in a position later in my career to really do more work at the intersection between those and bring a scientific approach to philosophy and a philosophical approach to science. And that's one of the things I'm interested in kind of trying to promote in the way we think about these things. And part of that relates to the kind of what I was just saying before, like people who are maybe more experiential to, I mean, not even highly scientifically, but just like think about what do you think your experiences are and what does it mean to you? How do you understand it? But this applies to atheists or non-theists as well, because there are just a lot of people who just don't care. And again, I'm not saying everyone needs to become philosophy professors or anything close to that. It's just like, I do think that there are a lot of important questions, like, about morality, about like where we came from, about how we know anything, where does knowledge come from? These sorts of basic questions that is important for people to at least consider, to have some curiosity about. And that's one of the things I like to try to encourage as well, and to make these things a bit more accessible. And I really don't like that there are some tendencies and maybe people who try to make this like presented as so complicated, mere mortals can't approach the complexity of this. And maybe I do this sometimes as well, because I do like getting into the details and really working hard at trying to understand things. But also I do think it's important to try to make things accessible and invite really everyone to think about these things at whatever level they're at, and encourage them to think about it more thoughtfully and rigorously and from different perspectives. And that's sort of, I guess, my meta level point. I obviously I do want to put my ideas forth and convince people, because I mean, I think they're correct, right? And I want people to criticize them if they think that they're wrong and give their best criticisms. But I would say more important than that is encouraging people to just think carefully and thoughtfully about these questions and have that as something that they value, as opposed to just sort of taking for granted whatever intuitions or inherited ideas or just things that they've absorbed from wherever, which is honestly what most people do, regardless of their perspective. They just sort of have all of this baggage of assumptions that they come to and don't really critically think about them. And I don't think that's good for a bunch of reasons. And it's not truth seeking for a start. And how do you know you're wrong if you don't think about these sorts of things? So that's the meta point, is in trying to encourage people to do that. And so I like to think that my book is an invitation to do that, obviously with a particular application. And I'm hoping to as I said, I'm working on early stages of a new book where I sort of more talk about my own worldview and how I see the different aspects of reality accounted for under naturalism. So that would be another thing that would be aimed as something to be provocative, but also like start a conversation about here's how I see it, how do you see it, how can we understand each other better and move forward. So yeah, that's kind of that's something I guess I'd like people to take away from what I've said, even if they disagree with a bunch of the particulars, is the value of that sort of inquiry and thought.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing your perspectives. I've really enjoyed it. So everybody, please do click on the links in the description to look at all of James's work and the Godless Theist. It was really fun. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Okay. And thank you everybody in the chat. I appreciate you guys being here. You guys are having great conversations. And so thank you very much.